Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And if you are watching this video right now, hell, even if you're not watching it, there's a very good chance that you owe your life to one man. And unless you're well versed in certain historical events, you've probably never heard of him. You might not even be aware of just how close you and everything you hold dear came to be completely and utterly destroyed. But you should know, we should know. The man's name is Vasili Arkhipov. He was an officer in the former Soviet Union. Born in the mid-1920s, he effectively lived through the rise and fall of the USSR. And, were it not for certain historical events and a perfect confluence of circumstances, Arkhipov would have just been another faceless cog in the Soviet military machine. But on one fateful day, October 27, 1962, this man found himself in a situation where the entire course of history, if not the fate of the entire human race, rested on his shoulders. It wasn't just one fateful decision or one singular act either, because on that day, Arkhipov just happened to be the right man in the right situation to do what needed to be done. And by doing what he did, we can accurately say that he is the man who saved the world. And on a more personal note, it's very likely that I owe this man my life. Because were it not for him, I never would have been born. I know this because I know where my father, my uncles, and my grandparents were on October 27, 1962. At that time, they all lived in an area just south of Washington, D.C. And according to my father, a trip to downtown D.C. was no more than a 20-minute bus ride depending on the traffic. That detail matters because had Vasili Arkhipov not been where he was that day, it's very likely that my father and his entire side of the family would have perished in a nuclear inferno. And I, Jack Fisher, never would have been born. So yeah, it's not unreasonable to say that I owe Mr. Arkhipov my life. It's also not unreasonable to say that millions, if not billions of people alive today owe him their life as well. But to appreciate what he did on October 27, 1962, it's also important to understand the events leading up to it. Before that fateful moment came for Mr. Arkhipov, the Cuban Missile Crisis had been unfolding for nearly 2 weeks. Most people who have taken a modern history class probably know of this event. It is not some minor historical footnote. But even those who are aware of the major details probably don't appreciate just how close it brought us to the brink of nuclear war. Now, I won't get into all the events surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a lot of geopolitical upheavals going on before, during, and after it. There are also numerous history-centric channels on YouTube that dig into every angle in detail. I'll even add a few links in the description. But, very generally, the crisis began on October 15, 1962, when the CIA identified a cache of Soviet-made medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. The very next day, President John F. Kennedy was informed of the missiles, and everyone in his cabinet agreed. This was a serious threat to America's safety and security. Because if those missiles were ever launched, it would take less than 20 minutes for one of them to reach Washington, D.C., and those missiles had a range that would allow them to rain nuclear hellfire on every major American city except for Seattle. There would be little to no warning. Even those who had nuclear fallout shelters probably wouldn't have had time to react. Kennedy knew this as well as everyone else in the DC area, including my father and grandparents. That's why he and his cabinet agreed that those missiles had to go. Now, to be fair, we already had the Soviet Union in a similar position. The United States had ballistic missiles based in Turkey, which were capable of reaching every major city in the Soviet Union. That too was a valid concern. The Soviet High Command might have even seen this as a balancing act to that threat. And even if there was merit to that logic, there was no denying what it led to. For the next 13 days, a tense standoff ensued. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in high-stakes negotiations, seeking a resolution that did not involve nuclear war. We still don't entirely know everything about what happened behind the scenes, but we do know that on more than one occasion, we came to within a few misguided decisions of total nuclear Armageddon. And it all came to a head on October 27th, 1962. This is where Vasili Arkhipov's role becomes key. On this day, he was an executive officer aboard a Foxtrot-class B-59 submarine that was bound for Cuba. This sub was part of a Soviet naval escort. It was part of a direct reaction to America's response to impose a quote-unquote weapons quarantine on Cuba. Now, this was not a full naval blockade, as that was considered an act of war. This action involved American naval vessels, including aircraft carriers and destroyers, inspecting all ships bound for Cuba to ensure that there were no weapons on board. But even with this partial measure in place, work on the missiles continued. It got so intense throughout that day that communications between the United States and the Soviet Union became increasingly apprehensive. There were even times when messages between Moscow and their Navy became spotty. And for that B-59 sub that Arkhipov was on, this was a serious issue. Because this submarine happened to be armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. Moreover, the officers on the sub were authorized to fire those torpedoes in the absence of an order from Moscow. The thinking was that if they didn't hear from the Soviet High Command, then that meant war had already begun, and it was on them to be part of the response, which entailed a full nuclear strike. And that fateful moment seemed to finally come on October 27, 1962, because while submerged, a group of US Navy destroyers located their sub and began launching depth charges. The intent was to force the sub to surface for identification, but from the perspective of everyone on board, it felt like an attack. The officers on board also hadn't heard from Moscow for days, so for all they knew, their entire country was being nuked to oblivion by American ICBMs. It certainly didn't help that this submarine was hot, cramped, and rapidly filling with toxic gases. These men might have thought they were going to die anyway, so they had both the authority and the duty to launch. However, in order to do so, the decision among the officers had to be unanimous, and Vasili Arkhipov was one of those three. The other two were Captain Valentin Grigorievich and Ivan Meslenikov. Both men had already made up their mind. They both believed that war had already started. They were ready to make that fateful decision, not knowing they would end up firing the first shot of World War III, a war that might very well end humanity. But Vasili Arkhipov did not share that sentiment. According to accounts that were later declassified, the men argued vehemently, and it was on Arkhipov to persuade the two other men that this was not an attack. This was instead an effort to force the sub to surface. Now, just take a moment to appreciate this kind of situation. You're in a cramped, overheated metal tube at the bottom of the ocean. There are ships above you dropping explosive depth charges around your vessel. Your fellow officers are in a panic. They think war has already broken out, and it's on you and you alone to convince them otherwise. And if you fail, it's all over. The torpedoes are launched, nuclear war begins, and in the end, nobody would win. But despite all these dire circumstances, despite the men around him believing that the world was already at war, Vasili Arkhipov did not waver. He remained calm, collected, and poised. His wife Olga would go on to say that his ability to remain calm and mindful was an integral part of his demeanor. Even in the most tense of situations, Arkhipov was the last one to panic. And because of that, he kept that B-59 submarine from launching its nuclear torpedo. He prevented the first shot of World War III from being fired. Instead, the sub surfaced, they made contact with Moscow, and they turned around and returned to the Soviet Union, war having been averted. At the time, Vasili Arkhipov did not know that he'd saved the world in that moment. But the very next day, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and America secretly agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey. Nuclear war had been averted, and everyone on both sides of the Iron Curtain, including my father, lived on. And it wouldn't be until many years later that both sides realized just how close they came to the brink. Even Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time of the crisis, admitted they'd come much closer to the nuclear war than any of them had realized. And it wasn't until the Cold War thawed that Vasili Arkhipov's role in averting that war came to light. He would go on to continue serving in the Soviet military for decades, eventually retiring in the mid-1980s. And ultimately, he passed away on August 19, 1998. While his death might not have been widely reported or celebrated, his place in history is definitely secured. Now, regardless of how you feel about the politics of the Cold War, regardless of how you feel about how justified or unjustified certain actions might have been, the fact remains, in the most intense moment of the conflict, Vasili Arkhipov was the right man in the right place at the right time. Because of him, the world was spared unimaginable death and destruction. Because of him, people like my father, my uncles, and my grandparents would go on to live their lives, never knowing such horrors or how close they'd come to facing them. Arkhipov literally had the fate of humanity resting on his shoulders. But he did not falter. He remained calm, collected, and astute when others around him couldn't. When the world seemed destined for a war that might very well end the human race, he pulled us back from the brink. So, on this day, regardless of whether you're in the United States, Russia, or the South Pole, take a moment to acknowledge and celebrate Vasili Arkhipov. This man didn't just save the world on October 27, 1962. Everyone alive today, myself included, owe their existence to him. And for that, I am truly grateful. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.